Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe, Member of Parliament, Honorable Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, Member of Parliament and Leader of Bharatiya Janata Party of India, the Secretary of Defence and Urban Development, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Defence Secretary of Pakistan, Your Excellencies, Chief of Defence Staff of Sri Lanka, Commander of the Sri Lanka Navy and Sri Lanka Air Force, Chief of Defence Force of Maldives, Royal Brunei Land Force Commander, past service commanders, guest speakers, distinguished delegates from home and abroad, ladies and gentlemen. The challenges that countries in crisis and post-conflict situations face are complex, multifaceted, and very varied due to the variety of different historical root causes of conflict and the different political, social, and geographical context. The strategies to address these challenges and effectively support a country on a path of recovery, development, and durable peace is therefore diverse. What works in one country does not necessarily work in another. Nevertheless, some principles are key to sustainable peace. These could be summarized as focused and committed leadership, security, solid government structures providing basic services, building people's trust and legitimacy, information dissemination, sound civic dialogue, mediation, and community participation. Fittingly, to put the Sri Lankan experience in context, this morning, we are fortunate to have Honorable Professor G.L. Peiris, the Minister of External Affairs of Sri Lanka. Professor Peiris earned a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford in 1971. He was a Rhodes Scholar of Oxford University from 1968 to 71. He has functioned as a Professor of Law, Dean of the Faculty of Law, and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo. He was a visiting fellow of All Souls College, University of Oxford during 1980-81, a distinguished visiting fellow of Christ's College, University of Cambridge during 1985-86, and a Butterworth visiting fellow of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in the University of London during 1983 and 84. He has authored 12 books and over 75 papers published in international journals. Professor Peiris entered Parliament in 1994 after his illustrious academic career and functioned in the portfolios of Minister of Export Development and Internal Trade, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, Minister of Ethnic Affairs and National Integration, Minister of Enterprise Development, Investment, Promotion and Industrial Policy. Professor Peiris has been closely associated with the foreign policy issues and has wide experience in law and international relations. It is my pleasure to call upon Professor G.L. Peiris to address you. Thank you.
Sri Subramaniam Swamy, Leader of the Bharat Janata Party, Dr. Rajiv Vijayasinghe, Member of the Parliament of Sri Lanka, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Secretary to the Ministry of Defence and Urban Development, Chief of Defence Staff, Commanders of the Army, Navy and Air Force, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates to this conference, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by congratulating Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the defense establishment on this very timely initiative. It can truly be described as a need of the hour, when there is a great deal of criticism founded upon erroneous premises, there are false assumptions made. I think the best answer to this is complete, accurate, up-to-date information. That was precisely what was provided to all of you in abundant measure by the comprehensive presentation that was made by Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa this morning. The purpose of this seminar is to focus upon the role of the armed forces during the conflict, remembering that it is not a role that came to an end with the cessation of the conflict in May 2009. It is very much a vibrant and continuing role, and we need today to understand clearly the nature and the scope of that role. It is to create that understanding that the seminar was conceived of, and it is the spirit in which that is now being presented to you. Now, I spoke of false impressions and misinformation. A great deal of this is attributable to local situations being approached from a cultural perspective, which is fundamentally different from the ground situation in Sri Lanka. There has been in some quarters considerable misunderstanding about the nature of the armed forces and their relationship to the Sri Lankan government and indeed the Sri Lankan community. European history has been dominated during extensive periods by conflicts among nations, between and among countries. And during those epochs, high-profile military leaders have dominated the political stage. Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to say that European history during those periods have revolved around personalities like Napoleon, and across the water, the Duke of Wellington, Bismarck of Germany, Garibaldi of Italy. It is these personalities who have molded the basic forces of European history at that time. Harold Laski, in his classic work, The Grammar of Politics, describes the armed forces of the state as the most visible expression of the aggressive authority of the state. Professor A.V. Dicey, in his famous Wynerian lectures delivered to the University of Oxford, defines the relationship between the armed forces and the state in strikingly similar terms. Now, I want to emphasize to you that the Sri Lankan situation is fundamentally different. What the armed forces were doing during the conflict was not an engagement against a foreign force. It was not an adventure of conquest. Far from it. It had an entirely different objective. That objective was to release an oppressed people from the thraldom of terror and make it possible for them to lead a life that was built upon dignity, freedom, and fairness. That was the role and objective of the armed forces. People who could not even think of making decisions for themselves, choices in a spirit of spontaneity. People who were subjugated and intimidated. These are the people to whom the army brought relief during that turbulent period in the contemporary history of our country. What are the manifestations of this? I recall a visit to Nagadeepa, that is a historic Buddhist temple situated in the Jaffna Peninsula. And I recall the chief incumbent of that temple telling me, Minister, I want to tell you that at the height of the conflict, when there was so much violence, no harm befell us at any time. Now, this is what the priest is telling me. The army and the navy at that time provided the priests in that temple with every meal. And he told me that the army and the navy looked after the priests in the temple just as they would have looked after their own parents. So that was the spirit of empathy and compassion which pervaded the activities of the Sri Lankan armed forces during that operation. In order to assess critically the validity of some of the criticisms that are made, let us look at the factual context. The situation in Nandikadal in the closing stages of the war represented undoubtedly the most serious hostage situation in modern military history in terms of numbers. 300,000 civilians trapped on a narrow strip of land between the lagoon and the sea. The LTTE using these civilians as cannon fodder, as human shields, compelling them to accompany the LTTE from place to place, to dig trenches, to do other work for them. Government of Sri Lanka announcing that they are welcome in the government-controlled areas where food, medical facilities, and freedom await them. The film that we were just shown gives you photographic evidence, visual evidence of the measures that were adopted by the LTTE to prevent these people from exercising their freedom of choice and having access to government-controlled areas. Indeed, the LTTE opened fire and killed many of them. There are also very moving pictures, which I have myself seen, of members of the army helping the aged, the sick, and children to cross the waters of the lagoon. These are very, very moving pictures. They do not epitomize aggression of the armed forces. On the contrary, the armed forces were playing a very unconventional and unorthodox role because of the nature of the operation and its inherent objectives. There's also misinformed criticism regarding the no-fire zones. But not only Sri Lankan government records, but contemporary records of the United Nations system demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt what really happened in that situation. The LTTE made systematic and persistent use of the no-fire zones to come into these areas, and with the full knowledge and assurance that the armed forces would not open fire. They considered themselves free to engage their activities, making use of that situation. And they used those areas